Hello folks, this is Mr. O'Brien, and in this video we will be going over Malcolm X's appearance at Oxford University, otherwise known as the Oxford Union Debate, December 3rd, 1964, very shortly before he was assassinated. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to read the head note with you guys. I'll read it, obviously, and then I have a YouTube video on my YouTube channel of the speech. And this is actually, it's interesting here because the video is 28 minutes long. And for the first about 14, 15 minutes, it's just a still photograph of Malcolm right outside the building in which it took place, the debate took place. Oxford Union, actually, is the building. And about 14, 15 minutes in, it changes to an actual video of Malcolm giving or participating in the debate. And I actually have it marked off. The spot right here, the purple Malcolm X spot, is right where it becomes kind of a real video feed. All right, so for about the first 14, 15 minutes, it's just a still photograph, but I assume I'll probably stop from time to time and talk about stuff. All right, so let's read the head note and then go through this. This is a little bit longer, so hunker down. All right, so here's the head note. Malcolm's conversion to a more traditional Islam, his rejection of the Nation of Islam tenets of white devilry, and his desire to be more politically active all figured into his decision to go to the capital and seek out King. In that encounter we talked about in the very beginning of this packet. Their encounter, he hoped, would convey and symbolize his new support for mainstream black protest and willingness to cooperate with all forces sincerely working for black people's liberation. So again, he was spending the last couple of years not only espousing more articulate and more intelligent, mature beliefs, nuanced beliefs, again, moving more towards King while King was moving more towards him, which you will see later on. He was also, the last couple of years, beginning to make overtures towards working with Dr. King and other civil rights activists. Second paragraph. Though still voicing important differences with King and other civil rights leaders, in his last year or so, Malcolm ceased his former ferocious verbal assaults on the leaders of the Nation of Civil Rights Organization, like Dr. King. He announced his willingness to join with all African American groups seeking to better blacks' conditions. During King-led civil disobedience campaigns in 64 and 65, Malcolm offered to provide armed defense for the black activists against the violent racist oppression they faced. On June 30th, 1964, Malcolm sent King a telegram in St. Augustine, Florida, which read, quote, "If the federal government will not send troops to your aid, just say the word and we will immediately dispatch some of our brothers there to organize self-defense units among our people. And the Ku Klux Klan will then receive a taste of its own medicine." All right, so it was reaching out to Dr. King in 1964. Malcolm made similar remarks during the subsequent campaign in Selma, Alabama, stating that, quote, "If I were there with King and I saw someone knocking on him, I'd come to the rescue." After the 1964 Civil Rights Act substantially ended legal segregation, King and the movement's next main objective became securing voting rights. Again, what you should be realizing here is that Malcolm never renounced his belief in self-defense. Malcolm publicly endorsed this goal too, securing voting rights. Remember the ballot or the bullet speech? The centerpiece of King and the SCLC's 1965 campaign in Selma. Unable to resist being near the action, Malcolm surprised King and the SCLC by visiting Selma during the campaign, having received an invitation from the younger and more radical members of SNCC. So by this time, by 64, 65, there was a younger generation of civil rights activists that were moving into leadership positions in groups like SNCC and were moving it in a more radical direction or aggressive direction, like Stokely Carmichael, for example. King and most of his SCLC colleagues were displeased by Malcolm's unexpected Selma appearance. This is what I was talking about previously. Nevertheless, after his talk, Malcolm had a few words with King's wife, Coretta, and fellow activist Coretta Scott King. He told her, quote, "I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking that I would make it easier. If the white people realize that the alternative is, if they realize what the alternative is what it should say, I believe, perhaps they will be more willing to help Dr. King. In other words, Malcolm was positioning himself as what you will wind up with if you don't listen to Dr. King. All right. So in a way, one argument you can easily make in your final paper is that Malcolm X and Dr. King had kind of this symbiotic relationship that depended upon each other, and they both knew it. All right. Dr. King knew this. All right. He knew that white people feared Malcolm X, and that made white people take him more seriously, and vice versa. Mrs. King said he stressed that he wanted to, quote, to work with Dr. King and not against him, close quote. She also recalls that King deeply appreciated Malcolm's relayed message. Now we get to Oxford. Malcolm at Oxford University, the below speech, it represents, and this is what you would say in your final paper, it represents the most comprehensive, best articulated, and clearest sense of his personal and political vision on the future of race relations, not only as a domestic concern, but also a global one. So it's the last speech we're going to hear from Malcolm, but not the last time we're going to hear from him, but the last live speech. Oxford and its audience were interactive, at times combative, and challenging in terms of a venue that demanded not only a passion and skill, but grace, precision, and substantive argument. So, he was in kind of a situation, in a context that was pretty uncomfortable for him. Oxford University is kind of like the epicenter of Anglo-Saxonism, right? It's this very privileged, very well-known university in England. Some people would argue it's the best university in the world. All right. So this was not an audience to which Malcolm was accustomed. All right. And he knew that. Where were we? Okay, 4 lines. Okay. It should be the Oxford Address certainly contained a number of elements from Malcolm's old racial narratives, but it largely was rooted in the future, one in which Malcolm was increasingly open to a revolutionary politics, absent of rigid separationist ideas he had advocated in the past. Right, so I'm articulating for you the change Malcolm went through. The Oxford speech suggests a pivotal moment in human history as the majority of the world's population begins to unyoke itself from colonial rule. Remember, African, Latin American, and Asian colonies getting their independence post-World War II. The demands of the future, rather than a mere articulation of the past, brought out the very best of Malcolm X, and it happened in Oxford. In the most basic sense, the speech represents what can only be called the lost jewel of the American civil rights movement. It actually isn't a very well-known speech, that's what I'm saying here. It is precisely because in that moment, one Dr. King would step into in 67 and 68, when he came out publicly against the Vietnam War, the nature of America's racial challenges could no longer stand on their own, meaning you couldn't think of just the racial challenges without thinking about other things, which you will see in this speech and in Dr. King's speech when he comes out against the Vietnam War. They had to be wed, these ideas of racial struggle had to be wed to the greater struggle for human dignity on a global scale. The Oxford speech is a 30-minute exposition, almost 28 minutes, that is perhaps the best encapsulation of Malcolm X's ultimate views on race, American politics, and what can only be called universal human rights. While clearly Malcolm's politics were evolving, and we cannot know for certain whether, let alone where, his ideology might have taken root or eventually landed, it is difficult to deny that he and Dr. King did not differ to the degree our memory seems to argue. And by virtue of his posture at Oxford, his humor and evident pleasure in delivering the speech, and his tone will be different in the speech than what you've seen previously, while also still being assertive and combative, challenging to his audience. So, and by virtue of his posture at Oxford, his humor and evident pleasure in delivering the speech, even down to receiving Berkeley's barbs, he was getting heckled a little bit by someone in the audience, he appears content. Berkeley's a person. In this respect, Oxford offers a unique window into Malcolm's personal and overwhelmingly private disposition. in this moment one that briefly punctured his own self-aware confrontation with death. That is, he felt his death was near, and he was assassinated soon after this. Malcolm X appears happy, though. Finally, this speech strongly suggests that Malcolm X was seeking to organize a black human rights movement not only in America, the Middle East, or Africa, but in cities such as Paris, London, and Amsterdam as well. It shows Malcolm X moving beyond black nationalism, while at the same time remaining militant in his words, but also rejecting the notion of whiteness, and accordingly blackness. It should be of whiteness. As you will see, Malcolm was attempting to convince the world that moving past the construct of race, or the idea of race, that it actually exists, a notion more radical and arguably more intellectual than integration, which to Malcolm was only a method on the road to moving past race. To Malcolm, this was the only true and worthwhile goal. To help us remember this speech and Malcolm's, and as you will see, Dr. King's attempt to tackle the nature of modern inequality, it may help to listen to something Malcolm told Simon Malley of Jeune Afrique, a magazine, shortly before his death. Quote, "I'm a Muslim, but I know that it's not in the mosques that we will win. It's in the streets and the cities, side by side with those who, whites included, want to rid the country of the racism that is eating it away. I too was a racist, but I learned and understood." And at the end of this headnote, I give you where I got that quote for citation purposes for your final paper, and it should be in your final paper. Okay, so let's begin listening to the speech, and we'll answer questions as we get to them. So you can follow along on the screen or in your packet. I actually kind of suggest doing it in your packet, and every once in a while taking a gander at the video. I'll leave the text on the screen until the part where I know it'll be actually Malcolm, a video of Malcolm, 15 minutes in. All right, so let's start the speech. And the picture here is only going to be a picture of Malcolm walking right outside the Oxford Union building.
Mr. Chairman, tonight is the first night that I've ever had an opportunity to be as near to conservatives as I am. And the speaker who preceded me, first I want to thank you for the invitation to come here to the Oxford Union. The speaker who preceded me is one of the best excuses that I know to prove our point concerning the necessity sometimes of extremism in defense of liberty, why it is no vice, and why moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. I don't say that about him personally.
Okay, a little bit about the context of this debate. So every year, Oxford holds a debate on a certain topic, right? And in the United States, there was a man named Barry Goldwater running for president. Okay, and he said something akin to radicalism to protect liberty is no vice. Okay, it's okay to be radical to protect liberty. All right, and Malcolm was there, and Barry Goldwater, historically speaking, ran quite a racist campaign as a Republican to become president, almost succeeding. And Malcolm, surprisingly, is there to, in his own way, defend that statement. All right, maybe not defend Barry Goldwater. They would not see eye to eye on things, obviously, but he's just there defending the sentiment. He's saying that's what he's doing. Okay?
But that type is the... He's right. X is not my real name. But if you study history, you'll find why no black man in the Western Hemisphere knows his real name. Some of his ancestors kidnapped our ancestors from Africa and took us into the Western Hemisphere and sold us there. And our names were stripped from us, and so today we don't know who we really are. I'm one of those who admit it, so I just put X up there to keep from wearing his name.
Okay, so when Malcolm referred to that type, he was talking about the either overtly or covertly racist, elitist white person. Someone who'd be critical, very critical of Malcolm and the fact that he uses X as his last name, things like that. All right. So Malcolm opens up by defending himself against words from the previous speaker.
And as far as this apartheid charge that he attributed to me is concerned, evidently he has been misinformed. I don't believe in any form of apartheid.
Racial separation.
I don't believe in any form of segregation. I don't believe in any form of racialism. But at the same time, I don't endorse a person as being right just because his skin is white. And oftentimes when you find people like this, I mean that type, when a man whom they have been taught is below them has the nerve or firmness to question some of their philosophy or some of their conclusions, usually they put that label on it, a label that is only designed to project an image which the public will find distasteful. I'm a Muslim. If there is something wrong with that, then I stand condemned. My religion is Islam. I believe in Allah. I believe in Muhammad as the apostle of Allah. I believe in brotherhood of all men. But I don't believe in brotherhood with anybody who's not ready to practice brotherhood with our people. I don't believe in...
Okay, so if you look at the first question, Malcolm in the second paragraph clarifies his thoughts on racial separation. All right, and that second paragraph is very important, and it should find its way into your final paper. All right, so he's been accused of being a racial separationist, a racial segregationist. The word apartheid is usually in our minds to refer to South Africa. You know, the small minority white population controlling the very large, overwhelming majority black population in South Africa. You know, racial apartheid. But it's also, you know, just a word that means racial separation, or one controlling the other. All right. So it's important to jot down on your paper and in your notes that Malcolm does not believe in racial separation or segregation or apartheid anymore, if ever. Right? Never believed in apartheid. But he also doesn't believe that just because a person's skin is white, you should assume they're correct. And just because a person's skin is not white, that they should remain quiet and silent and not be assertive in their own rights and their own presence. Okay? So another very important sentence here is, you know, I don't believe in brotherhood with anybody who's not ready to practice brotherhood with our people. All right? So, again, this is part of Malcolm not condemning all white people as, quote, white devils, or collectively as white devils. He's just saying, if you don't want to be with us, we don't want to be with you. But if you do want to be with us, fine. All right, so let's keep going.
I just take time to make these few things clear because I find that one of the tricks of the West, and I imagine my good friend, or at least that type is from the West, one of the tricks of the West is to use or create images. It's
also very, very intelligent of Malcolm to cast him as a type or a stereotype, right? As someone less than thinking. All right. It's also important to jot down for the first question. I forgot that he's being anti-racist. When he says he doesn't believe in any form of racialism, that's Malcolm more or less saying he knows it's not real. It's a construct. And to be racialist is to believe that race is real and it exists and it's a fact. Okay. All right.
They create images of a person who doesn't go along with their views, and they make certain that this image is distasteful, and then anything that person has to say from there on in, is rejected. And this is a policy that has been practiced pretty well pretty much by the West. It perhaps would have been practiced by others had they been in power, but during recent centuries, the West has been in power. They've created the images, and they've used these images quite skillfully and quite successfully. That's why today we need a little extremism in order to straighten a very nasty situation out, or a very extremely nasty situation out. I think the only...
Okay, so now we can answer the next question. All right. Malcolm X, in the second paragraph, he also finds it necessary to defend himself from the previous speaker. Explain. He talks about how, and I think it was the third paragraph too, when someone who is thought to be below someone else, like a black person being below the white race, everything they say winds up being questioned, or branded as too radical or incorrect or scary or distasteful. Okay, and that's the answer to the, let me get out there. The second question, let me make sure it's correct. Yes, it is. All right. And even the next question we can answer. In the third paragraph, what is the quote West? And remember what we mean by the West: Europe, the United States, maybe even Canada, capital W. By West, we also mean like the Anglo-Saxon world, the white world. And we're probably even talking more about Western Europe than we are of all Europe. All right. So what Malcolm talks about, and what we just heard, is the West creates in the media, they create this image of a person. All right. And if this person is considered to be below a white person, everything they say is considered to be distasteful. Anything and everything that person says, once they're branded as incorrect, as radical, as scary, everything they say is to be dismissed by the public, by the white public especially. Okay? Anytime, in Malcolm's view, anyone is oppressed, it becomes very objectionable, something that can't be tolerated. And he argues, as you will hear in the next paragraph, that when someone is being oppressed, radicalism is needed to defeat it. Okay? So let's hear that.
The only way one can really determine whether or not extremism in defense of liberty is justified is not to approach it as an American or a European or an African or an Asian, but as a human being. If we look upon it as different types, immediately we begin to think in terms of extremism being good for one and bad for another, or bad for one and good for another. But if we look upon it, we look upon ourselves as human beings. I doubt that anyone will deny that extremism in defense of liberty, the liberty of any human being, is a vice. Anytime anyone is enslaved or in any way deprived of his liberty, that person is a human being. As far as I'm concerned, he is justified to resort to whatever method necessary to bring about his liberty again.
Okay, so that's the answer to the next question, right? Malcolm X, in the fourth paragraph, describes how he thinks the West defines radicalism. What type is acceptable, what type is not. All right. And he argues that we need to think of this in terms of being human, not white versus black, right? So he's basically saying if someone's being oppressed in some way, then radicalism is good, in his view, because it helps overcome that oppression. All right. In other words, too often he's saying here, we think one type of radicalism is okay because a certain type of person is doing it, but we don't think it's okay when another type of person is doing it. But he says if we think of it in terms of just a human being doing it, and the question is, are they being oppressed, then we wind up looking at radicalism as being much more acceptable. All right. Let's move on.
But most people usually think of extremism as something that's relative, related to someone whom they know or something that they've heard of. I don't think they look upon extremism as by itself or all alone. They apply it to something. A good example, and one of the reasons that it can't be too well understood today, many people who have been in positions of power in the past don't realize that the power, centers of power are changing. When you're in a position of power for a long time, you get used to using your yardstick, and you take it for granted that because you forced your yardstick upon others, that everyone is still using the same yardstick. So that your definition of extremism usually applies to everyone. But nowadays, times are changing, and the center of power is changing. People in the past who weren't in a position to have a yardstick or use a yardstick of their own are using their own yardstick now. You use one, and they use another. In the past, when the oppressor had one stick and the oppressed used that same stick, today the oppressed are sort of shaking the shackle and getting yardsticks of their own. So when they say extremism, they don't mean what you do. And when you say extremism, you don't mean what they do. It's entirely two different meanings. And when this is understood, I think you can better understand why those who are using methods of extremism are being driven to them. A good example is the Congo.
Okay, so yeah, he goes on to speak about the example in the Congo. All right. So in the next question, all right. Actually, you know what? Let's listen to more of the speech, because the question talks about paragraphs 5 through 8.
When the people who are in power want to create an image to justify something that's bad, they use the press, and they'll use the press to create a humanitarian image for a devil, or a devil image for a humanitarian. They'll take a person who's the victim of the crime and make it appear he's the criminal, and they'll take the criminal and make it appear that he's the victim of the crime. And the Congo situation is one of the best examples that I can cite right now to point this out. The Congo situation is a nasty example of how a country, because it is in power, can take its press.
All right, so just to give you a little bit of the context here, a man by the name of Patrice Lumumba was elected in the Congo in the 60s. And Lumumba was very left-leaning, very socialist-leaning, all right, Marxist-leaning. And he was beginning to advocate and to put into place policies along those lines. I mean, land reform, all right, throughout the Congo. He was extremely popular in the Congo, democratically elected, and he was eventually overthrown in a coup that was assisted in great part by the United States and was approved by Eisenhower. And that's what Malcolm is talking about here, how Lumumba was portrayed as this devil, and his assassins were portrayed as the freedom fighters, the heroes.
And make the world accept something that's absolutely criminal. They take American trained, they take pilots that they say are American trained, and this automatically lends respectability to them. And then they will call them anti-Cuban, anti-Castro Cubans, and that's supposed to add to their respectability. And eliminates the fact that they're dropping bombs on villages where they have no defense whatsoever against such claims, blowing to bits black women, Congolese children, Congolese babies. This is extremism. But it is never referred to as extremism because it is endorsed by the West, it's financed by America, it's made respectable by America, and that kind of extremism is never labeled as extremism because it's not extremism in defense of liberty. And if it is extremism in defense of liberty, as this text has just pointed out, it's extremism in defense of liberty for the wrong type of people. I'm not advocating that kind of extremism. That's cold-blooded murder. But the press is used to make that cold-blooded murder appear as an act of humanitarianism. They take it one step farther and get a man named Chomby, who is a murderer. They refer to him as the premier or the prime minister of the Congo to lend respectability to him. He's actually the murderer of the rightful prime minister of the Congo. They never mention that this man...
Shombe is the guy who was put into place to replace Lumumba.
I'm not for extremism in the sense of that kind of liberty or that kind of activity. They take this man who's a murderer. The world recognizes him as a murderer, but they make him the prime minister. He becomes a paid murderer, a paid killer who is propped up by American dollars. And to show the degree to which he is a paid killer, the first thing he does is go to South Africa and hire more killers and bring them into the Congo. They give them the glorious name of mercenary, which means a hired killer, not someone that's killing for some kind of patriotism or some kind of ideal, but a man who is a paid killer, a hired killer. And one of the leaders of them is right from this country here. And he's glorified as a soldier of fortune when he's shooting down little black women and black babies and black children. I'm not for that kind of extremism. I'm for the kind of extremism that those who are being destroyed by those bombs and destroyed by those hired killers are able to put forth to thwart it. They will risk their lives at any cost. They will sacrifice their lives at any cost against that kind of criminal activity. I'm for the kind of extremism that the freedom fighters in the Stanleyville regime are able to display against these hired killers who are actually using some of my tax dollars that I have to pay up in the United States to finance that operation over there. We're not for that kind of extremism.
All right, Stanleyville is in the Congo. It's a city in the Congo. All right, so that question about paragraphs 5 through 8, how does Malcolm contest the, quote, Western conception of extremism? All right, and he says a couple of things here. All right, Westerners tend to think of their definition of extremism as the only definition of extremism. Right, that's what he's talking about when he's talking about the yardstick, right? The West, he argues, tends to kind of try to force their yardstick onto everybody, assuming it's the best type of yardstick. But now, according to Malcolm, what he's saying is now people of color have their own yardsticks, and they're defining extremism differently than the way you define extremism. All right, where's the paragraph that talks about that? All right. I believe it's this one. Extremism. Right. Right. People in the past who weren't in a position to have a yardstick or use a yardstick of their own are using their own yardstick now. In other words, they're defining their own conceptions of what acceptable extremism is in defense of their own freedoms. All right, it's still acceptable extremism in Malcolm's mind, but it's a different yardstick, it's a different idea, it's different activities. Okay, and he brings up the Congo as a perfect example of what he's talking about, right? So this man Shombe wasn't the best human being, to be polite about it. He was a murderer, and he took over in the Congo in a violent coup, killed many people. All right, Lumumba also was executed. All right, and in the popular media, in the Western media, Lumumba is this scary left-leaning Stalin type that had to be eradicated, and Shombe was this capitalist-friendly, white people-friendly savior. Okay, and the trained squads that performed the military coup, these anti-Castro Cubans that helped out, were billed as humanitarians, when and what Malcolm is arguing is in reality it's the opposite. All right, and what he argues is the people on the ground in the Congo should have been able to defend, or if they were able to defend themselves and did it violently, that would have been acceptable extremism. Okay, so again, what he's saying here is the Western notion of extremism and that's acceptable isn't the same as everybody else's. All right, and now more people who never had a yardstick before, who never asserted their extreme behavior in defense of their own freedom, are now doing so. That's kind of what he's talking about. Okay, he also, again, this is what you should jot down. He says the Western press creates this image as the victim, image of the victim being the perpetrator. Lumumba was the victim here, but he was portrayed as this evil villain. Okay, so they make the victim look like the devil, and they make the oppressor look like the humanitarian. All right, because of who they think can perform acceptable extremism. All right, helping a coup in the Congo is extreme. All right, and in the Western mindset, it's okay because of who's doing the coup. Reverse the roles, and it wouldn't be acceptable, is what Malcolm is saying, and he's saying that's hypocritical. Okay, so what he's saying is anything endorsed by the U.S. by England, quote, seems to be acceptable extremism, and anything that's not endorsed by them is unacceptable extremism. All right, and he thinks that's quite hypocritical. Okay, so let's move on. I think at this point we have actual video of Malcolm. I think now it goes into a Q&A. Oh, no, it's too early.
Yes.
Not yet.
I wonder exactly what sort of extremism you would consider the killing of...
Okay, so a white individual from the audience asked Malcolm if what sort of extremism would you consider the killing of missionaries? So there were Christian missionaries in the Congo that wound up dead. And in a way, this question is kind of accusatory. Like, do you approve of that kind of thing? Kind of similar to the questions he got after his Hajj from the reporters. All right, let's listen to his response.
I don't encourage any act of murder, nor do I glorify in anybody's death. But I do think that when the white public uses its press to magnify the fact that there are the lives of white hostages at stake, they don't say hostages. Every paper says white hostages. They give me the impression that they attach more importance to a white hostage and a white death than they do the death of a human being, despite the color of his skin. I feel forced to make that point clear, that I'm not for any indiscriminate killing, and nor does the death of so many people go by me without creating some kind of emotion. But I think that white people are making the mistake, and if they read their own newspapers, they will have to agree that they, in clear-cut language, make a distinction between the type of dying according to the color of the skin. And when you begin to think in terms of death being death, no matter what type of human being it is, then we will all probably be able to sit down as human beings and get rid of this extremism and moderation. But as long as the situation exists as it is, we're going to need some extremism, and I think some of you will need some moderation too. One of the reasons...
All right, so we're going to answer the first part of the next question. In Malcolm's response to the first question, what does he claim is the double standard regarding the death of certain human beings versus others? And it's all right in this paragraph here. I mean, he talks about, he argues that the press seems to treat the deaths of white people as somehow more important than the deaths of non-white folks. All right. The next part of the question is how does he use himself as an example? That's what he talks about here.
That I think it's necessary for me to clarify my own point personally. I was in a conversation with a student here on the campus yesterday, and she, after we were I think we had coffee or something, dinner, there were several of us. I have to add that in for those minds of yours that run astray. And she asked me...
He's poking fun at the historical trope of the white man thinking the black man is up to devious activity with white women.
He told me that, well, I'm surprised that you're not what I expected. I said, what did you mean? What do you mean? She said, well, I was looking for your horn. And so I told her, I have them, but I keep them hidden. Unless someone draws them out. As my friend, or that type. It takes certain types to draw them out.
He's making fun of that guy again.
And this is actually true. Usually, if a person is looked upon as an extremist, anything that person does in your eyesight is extreme. On the other hand, if a person is looked upon as conservative, just about anything they do is conservative. And this comes again through the manipulating of images. What they want you to think that a certain area or a certain person or a certain group is extremist and or rather is involved in actions of extremism. The first thing they do is project that person in the image of an extremist. And then anything that he does from then on is extreme. It doesn't make a difference whether it's right or wrong. As far as you're concerned, if the image is wrong, whatever they do is wrong. And this has been done by the Western press and also by the American press, and it has been picked up by the English press and the European press. Whenever any black man in America shows signs of an uncompromising attitude against the injustices that he experiences daily and shows no tendency whatsoever to deal or compromise with it, then the American press begins to project that person as a radical, an extremist, somebody who's irresponsible, or as a rabble rouser, or someone who doesn't rationalize in dealing with the problem.
All right, so that's how he uses himself as an example of his argument, right? He claims that he's been portrayed in the media, in the Western media, largely as this dangerous radical extremist, someone to be scared of, this angry black man. And he relays the story of the young woman who expected him to be devilish and have horns. I mean, she didn't mean that literally, but her point was, I expected you to be this much different type of person than you actually are. So Malcolm uses that experience to kind of bring home his point that whenever you guys peg someone as an extremist, using your very narrow definition of permissible extremism, that whatever that person does is then branded as insufficient and worthy of dismissal. All right. So now I believe we get to the part, or close to the part, where it becomes video. All right. So again, he's still answering questions.
I wonder whether you consider that you have this evening projected rather successfully a quite unpleasant image of the climate.
It depends on which angle. No, let the gentleman bring out his point. It depends on which angle you look at it, sir. I never try and hide what I am.
I'm referring to your treatment of previous speakers.
All right, so this is actually really good. So again, he's being asked a question by his audience, white conservative audience, and the audience member basically accuses Malcolm of being rude to the previous speaker. All right, as we saw, Malcolm keeps referring to him as a type. I know. I kept saying he keeps making fun of him, but that's not really. It's not what he was doing. He was making a point. All right. So what I might want to do is shrink this so we can see it when I move it to the side. Oh, I can't really see that all that well. All right. And still play the video. Let me move down. Let me see if I can make it a little bit bigger, a bit larger. Okay, that's better. I can see that.
You're referring to my treatment of the previous speaker. You make my point. That as long as a white man does it, it's all right. A black man is supposed to have no feelings. But when a black man strikes back, he's an extremist. He's supposed to sit passively and have no feelings, be nonviolent, and love his enemy. No matter what kind of attack, be it verbal or otherwise, he's supposed to take it. But if he stands up and in any way tries to defend himself, then he's an extremist.
All right. Deep laugh there. So that's your answer there. I mean, the next question. How does Malcolm X's response to the second question reinforce his response to the first question? So what you should jot down is he was being accused of being rude to the previous speaker, But Malcolm kind of flips it around and says, that just proves my point. All right. The previous speaker was very, very critical of Malcolm. All right. But now that Malcolm is standing up for himself, he's the one who's being portrayed as in the wrong by that member of the audience, or by other maybe white eyes that are watching. All right. So he goes, when a black man strikes back, he's an extremist. But that white guy, you don't consider him an extremist. He's supposed to sit passively and have no feelings, be nonviolent, and love his enemy no matter what kind of attack, verbal or otherwise. He's supposed to take it. But if he stands up in any way and tries to defend himself, he's an extremist. So in Malcolm's view, that proves his point. All right. So the next few paragraphs are very important to understand the idea of what Malcolm calls intelligently directed extremism.
I think that the speaker who preceded me is getting exactly what he asked for. My reason for believing in extremism, intelligently directed extremism, extremism in defense of liberty, extremism in quest of justice, is because I firmly believe in my heart that the day that the black man takes an uncompromising step and realizes that he's within his rights, when his own freedom is being jeopardized, to use any means necessary to bring about his freedom or put a halt to that injustice, I don't think he'll be by himself. I live in America where there are only 22 million blacks against probably 160 million whites. One of the reasons that I am in no way reluctant or hesitant to do whatever is necessary to see that black people do something to protect themselves, I honestly believe that the day that they do, many whites will have more respect for them, and that there will be more whites on their side than are now on their side with these little wishy-washy love thy enemy approach that they've been using up to now. And if I'm wrong, then you're a racialist.
All right. That was actually pretty brilliant, that last sentence there. We'll go over that. So the next question, in Malcolm X's response to the second question, what does he think will be the result of what he calls intelligently directed extremism? So as you saw in the first, say, 8 or 9 lines of this paragraph, he thinks that once African Americans do stand up for themselves, they will gain the respect of white people. All right. It's towards the end. He says, I honestly believe that the day that they do, many whites will have more respect for them, and there'll be more whites on their side than there are now on their side with these little wishy-washy love thy enemy approach that they've been using up until now. All right, and now the next question. All right, we can also answer from this. What does Malcolm mean when he states, and if I am wrong, then you are a racialist? Remember what the word racialist means. It means that you believe race is real. It's a biological fact that someone's phenotype, the color of their skin, can tell you about the content of their character, their work ethic, their intelligence, things like that. All right. And what Malcolm is basically saying here is, okay, so his claim here is, if we stand up for ourselves, for our freedom, we should gain the respect of white people. And he says, if I'm wrong, then you are a racialist. What that means is that you will be the racist, because you will, if we stand up for ourselves and white people don't respect us in response, then they themselves are racist. They are a racialist. Okay? Because you are not respecting African Americans for standing up for their rights. All right? So he kind of flips it around on them. Okay? If he's wrong and they don't get that respect, it's because white people were racist. He's calling the audience out on their racism, basically, here. Okay? All right, so let's move on.
As I said earlier, in my conclusion, I'm a Muslim. I believe in the religion of Islam. I believe in Allah. I believe in Muhammad. I believe in all of the prophets. I believe in fasting, prayer, charity, and that which is incumbent upon a Muslim to fulfill in order to be a Muslim. In April, I was fortunate to make the Hajj to Mecca and went back again in September to try and carry out my religious functions and requirements. But at the same time that I believe in that religion, I have to point out I'm also an American Negro. And I live in a society whose social system is based upon the castration of the black man, whose political system is based on castration of the black man, and whose economy is based upon the castration of the black man. A society which in 1964 has more subtle, deceptive, deceitful methods to make the rest of the world think that it's cleaning up its house, while at the same time the same things are happening to us in 1964 that happened in 1954, 1924, and in 1984. They came up with what they call a civil rights bill in 1964, supposedly to solve our problem, and after the bill was signed, 3 civil rights workers were murdered in cold blood.
He's talking about the murders in Mississippi, the Freedom Summer in Mississippi.
And the FBI head, Hoover, admits that they know who did it. They've known ever since it happened, and they've done nothing about it. Civil rights bill down the drain. No matter how many bills pass, black people in that country, where I'm from, still our lives are not worth 2 cents. And the government has shown its inability, or either its unwillingness, to do whatever is necessary to protect life and property where the black American is concerned. So my contention is that whenever a people come to the conclusion that the government which they have supported proves itself unwilling or proves itself unable to protect our lives and protect our property because we have the wrong color skin. We are not human beings unless we ourselves band together and do whatever, however, whenever is necessary to see that our lives and our property is protected. And I doubt that any person in here would refuse to do the same thing were he in the same position, or I should say were he in the same condition.
All right, very good stuff here. So if you look at the next question, also in response to the second question that Malcolm got, how does Malcolm express his frustration with the state of the civil rights movement? And as we saw here, it just talks about several legislative successes, 64, 65, and 68, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, and the Housing Rights Act. All right, well, not 68 yet. You didn't know that one hadn't happened yet. So 64 and 65. These large legislative victories, and the same things are happening. All right, so that's kind of what he's talking about there. And the end of that paragraph that's bold and italicized, I did that. All right, and that's what he's arguing, and he's made that argument in previous speeches, right? Whenever a government that you've supported proves itself unwilling or unable to protect your property because you have the wrong color skin, it's up to you yourself to protect it by any means necessary. And that was his argument.
Just one step farther to see am I justified in this stand. And I say, I'm speaking as a black man from America, which is a racist society. No matter how much you hear it talk about democracy, it's as racist as South Africa, or as racist as Portugal, or as racist as any other racialist society on this earth. The only difference between it and South Africa preaches separation and practices separation. America preaches integration and practices segregation. This is the only difference. They don't practice what they preach. Whereas South Africa preaches and practices the same thing. I have more respect for a man who lets me know where he stands, even if he's wrong, than the one who comes up like an angel and is nothing but a devil.
All right. So that's the next question. How does Malcolm think that the U.S. compares to apartheid South Africa? Just as racist, but at least South Africa is upfront about how racist they are. All right. Let's move on.
The system of government that America has consists of committees. There are 16 senatorial committees that govern the country and 20 congressional committees.
10 of the 16 senatorial committees are in the hands of Southern racialist senators who are racialists. 13 of the 20, this was before the last election. I think it's even more so now. 10 of the 16 committees, senatorial committees, are in the hands of senators who are Southern racialists. 13 of the 20 congressional committees were in the hands of Southern congressmen who are racialists, which means out of the 36 committees that govern the foreign and domestic direction of that government, 23 are in the hands of Southern racialists, men who in no way believe in the equality of man, and men who do anything within their power to see that the black man never gets to the same seat or to the same level that they are on. The reason that these men from that area have that type of power is because America has a seniority system. And these who have that seniority have been there longer than anyone else because the black people in the areas where they live can't vote. And it is only because the black man is deprived of his vote that puts these men in positions of power that gives them such influence in the government beyond their actual intellectual or political ability, or even beyond the number of people from the areas that they represent. So we can see in that country that no matter what the federal government professes to be doing, the power of the federal government lies in these committees, and any time a black man or any kind of legislation is proposed to benefit the black man or give the black man his just due, we find that it's locked up in these committees right here. And when they let something through the committee, usually it is so chopped up and fixed up that by the time it becomes law, it's a law that can't be enforced.
All right, so we talked about this before, right? So all these committees in the Senate and the House, anytime a bill is proposed, the bill has to go to these various committees, and the bill does not leave the committees until the committee votes and approves the bill. And once all the committees approve of their version of the bill, it then goes to a vote of the entire House and the entire Senate. But remember, these committees can change the proposal. And what Malcolm is arguing is anytime a bill is proposed that would benefit African Americans, it has to go through a couple of dozen of these committees that are led by Southern racists, and it winds up being watered down and toothless by the time it gets passed, if it gets passed at all. And the only reason they have this power is because of the seniority system. The most senior members of the House and of the Senate get to run these committees. And Jim Crow, the disenfranchising of African Americans down south for almost 100 years after slavery was over, has enabled them to accrue the seniority necessary to run these committees.
Well, another example.
And that isn't a question, I don't think.
Example is the Supreme Court desegregation decision that was handed down.
Oh, yeah, it is a question. What does Malcolm X discuss? Why does he discuss the committee process in the United States Congress? And that's what we just talked about. All right, so make sure you have that filled in. Let's move on.
In 1954, this is a law. And this law, they have not been able to implement this law in New York City or in Boston or in Cleveland or Chicago or the northern cities. And my contention is that any time you have a country, supposedly a democracy, supposedly the land of the free and the home of the brave, and it can't enforce laws, even in the northernmost cosmopolitan and progressive part of it, that will benefit a black man, if those laws can't be enforced or that law can't be enforced, how much heart do you think we will get when they pass some civil rights legislation which only involves more laws? If they can't enforce this law, they'll never enforce those laws. So my contention is that we are faced with a racialistic society, a society in which they are deceitful, deceptive, and the only way we can bring about a change is to talk the kind of language, speak the language that they understand.
Violent self-defense.
The racialist never understands a peaceful language. The racialist never understands the nonviolent language. The racialist, he's spoken his language to us for 400 years. We have been the victim of his brutality. We are the ones who face his dogs that tear the flesh from our limbs, only because we want to enforce the Supreme Court decision. We are the ones who have our skulls crushed, not by the Ku Klux Klan, but by policemen, only because we want to enforce what they call the Supreme Court decision. We are the ones upon whom water hoses are turned with pressure so hard that it rips the clothes from our backs. Not men, but the clothes from the backs of women and children. You've seen it yourself. only because we want to enforce what they call the law. Well, anytime you live in a society supposedly based upon law, and it doesn't enforce its own law because the color of a man's skin happens to be wrong, then I say those people are justified to resort to any means necessary to bring about justice where the government can't give them justice.
All right, it's a pretty solid argument there. So next question, what does Malcolm X mean when he argues that Negroes in the U.S. must speak the language of the white man? He talks about the 400-year history of white United States violently crushing African Americans and arguing that's the only language they understand. All right, they don't understand the nonviolent language. All right, you talk about, he's calling it hypocritical, right? You've been speaking that language to us, he would say, for 400 years. Now we're finally speaking it back. And remember, he's talking about intelligently directed extremism here. All right, retaliatory self-defense is included in that.
I don't believe in any form of unjustified extremism. But I believe that when a man is exercising extremism, a human being is exercising extremism.
Remember, he argues that we need to, when we ask ourselves the question, is it justified, we cannot consider the person's race. It has to be, is that human being justified?
In defense of liberty for human beings, it's no vice. And when one is moderate in the pursuit of justice for human beings, I say he's a sinner. And I might add in my conclusion, in fact, America is one of the best examples when you read its history about extremism. Old Patrick Henry said, liberty or death. That's extreme.
Right, so what he's pointing out here, and this is the answer to the next question, why does Malcolm think that extremism is justified in the case of the civil rights movement? It's in defense of liberty and freedom. All right, how does he use white history to support the claim? The American Revolution. Patrick Henry, what did he say? Give me liberty or give me death. Right, he's basically saying, why is it okay for Patrick Henry to say that, but not for Malcolm X to say that?
I read once, passingly, about a man named Shakespeare. I only read about him passingly, but I remember one thing he wrote that kind of moved me. He put it in the mouth of Hamlet, I think it was, who said, to be or not to be. He was in doubt about something. Whether it was nobler in the mind of man to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, moderation, or to take up arms against the sea of troubles and by opposing, end them. And I go for that. If you take up arms, you'll end it. But if you sit around and wait for the one who's in power to make up his mind that he should end it, you'll be waiting a long time. And in my opinion, the young generation of whites, blacks, browns, whatever else there is, you're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change. People in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built, and the only way it's going to be built is with extreme methods. And I, for one, will join in with anyone, don't care what color you are, as long as you want to change this miserable condition that exists on this earth. Thank you.
All right, the last sentence is quite important. All right, so that last question, I think it's the last question. All right, how does Malcolm use Shakespeare to support his entire thesis? So he, if you go back to the phrase to be or not to be, all right, the not to be part means should you sit back and accept the slings and arrows of outrageous bad fortune, or should you fight back? Should you be? That's kind of what he's saying the moment we're in now, to be or not to be. This is our chance to be, all right, to resist and to rebel, okay, and fight for your rights. So that is Malcolm's Oxford Union debate.